I never imagined my mother-in-law would kick me out of her house before 9 in the morning, but that's exactly what happened. One moment I was pouring coffee, the next she was standing behind me like a shadow, telling me in that icy, clipped tone that I needed to leave the house for the day. The way she said it didn't sound like a suggestion, more like a threat wrapped in politeness. My stomach dropped so hard I swear the mug trembled in my hand. Life in her home had always been tense, but lately the air felt thick enough to choke on. Mark and I had agreed to stay with her while we saved for our first home, a plan that sounded temporary and harmless at the time. Instead, it turned into a daily routine of me tiptoeing around her moods, trying not to give her another reason to sigh dramatically or roll her eyes. Somehow, every simple thing I did, washing dishes, folding laundry, cooking rice, became a target. I tried asking Mark if he noticed how hostile she'd become, but he always brushed it off with an awkward laugh. He said she was just adjusting to having someone else in the house, as if I were some stray animal who wandered in. Every time he said things like that, I felt a small sting in my chest, wondering why my presence felt like an inconvenience instead of family. But I kept telling myself it was temporary, that once we moved out, everything would settle. But that morning, nothing about her expression suggested something temporary. She planted herself between me and the hallway, her arms folded tightly, her lips thin with tension. She didn't shout, she never did, but her voice held a cold finality that made my skin prickle. When I asked why she wanted me gone, she simply said the house needed peace today, as if I were the source of chaos. I glanced toward the bedroom, silently begging for Mark to come out and intervene. Instead, he stepped into the hallway with his head lowered, avoiding my eyes like they were too bright to look at. He gave me a tight, nervous smile that only made my confusion worse, and he didn't say a single word in my defense. The sight of him standing with his hands shoved into his pockets, shoulders tense, made me feel betrayed in a way I wasn't prepared for. When I walked out the front door with my keys and phone, I felt like a guest being ushered out after overstaying my welcome. The door clicked shut behind me, and seconds later I heard the lock turn with a sharp finality that hit me harder than I expected. The morning air felt cold against my skin, and for a moment I just stood there on the porch, stunned by the sheer audacity of what had just happened. I kept waiting for Mark to rush out and say it was all a misunderstanding. He didn't. As I walked down the driveway, the weight of humiliation settled heavily in my chest, making each breath feel shallow. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself maybe Linda was hosting a meeting or dealing with something sensitive. But the truth gnawed at me. She didn't want me there, and Mark didn't fight for me to stay. That realization stung sharper than the morning cold. I wandered through the neighborhood in a daze, my eyes drifting over familiar houses and empty sidewalks. The distant hum of a lawnmower blended with the chirping birds, but everything felt strangely muted, as if my mind couldn't process normal sounds. I replayed the morning over and over, searching for an explanation that didn't involve malice or secrets. But with every step, the feeling that something deeper was wrong grew stronger. By the time I reached the small park a few blocks away, frustration had replaced confusion. I sank onto a bench, gripping my phone tightly as questions spiraled through my head. Why was Linda suddenly so desperate to get me out of the house? And why had Mark looked like he was hiding something instead of standing by me like a husband should? That was when I realized something had been off in their behavior for weeks, and it wasn't just about me overstaying my welcome. Their whispered conversations, the hushed phone calls, the way they stopped talking when I walked into the room, it all came flooding back in sharp detail. For the first time, I let myself consider what I had been avoiding. Something was going on behind my back, and for some reason, they didn't want me anywhere near the house to find out. As I sat in the park, replaying the morning in my mind, the confusion slowly shifted into a dull ache that pulsed behind my ribs. I knew Linda disliked me, but today felt different, almost calculated. There was a precision to her words, an urgency in her voice that couldn't be explained by normal tension. And the way Mark avoided looking at me lingered in my mind like a bruise. I texted him twice, asking if we could talk, but both messages sat unread for nearly an hour. The little gray delivered icon felt like its own kind of rejection, small but piercing. I kept watching the time tick by, wondering if he was still in the house, pretending everything was normal while I sat outside like an exile. Each minute made the humiliation deepen. A breeze rustled through the trees above me, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass and something faintly metallic. My nerves were so raw that even the laughter of distant kids on the playground sounded sharp and out of place. It struck me how pathetic I must look, sitting alone on a bench waiting for scraps of attention from my own husband. The thought made my throat tighten. When my phone finally buzzed, I snatched it up with hope, only to deflate immediately. Mark sent a short text telling me he was handling something and would explain later. No apology, no reassurance, not even a hint of the comfort I needed. The message felt cold, rehearsed, almost fearful. But things were about to get much worse. After an hour of pacing and stewing, I decided to walk back by the house to see if Mark was even still there. I kept a distance, not wanting to trigger another confrontation with Linda, but I needed to know whether my husband was avoiding me or trapped by something. When I approached quietly, I heard her voice drifting through an open window, sharp and agitated. Something in her tone made my skin prickle. I edged closer, pressing myself behind the side fence, feeling ridiculous but too desperate to stop. Linda spoke quickly. Her words rushed and hushed, as if secrecy mattered more than volume. I couldn't make out everything, but what I did hear turned my stomach. She notices things, she said. She asks too many questions. She's a liability. The word liability hit me with a cold rush. I froze in place, gripping the fence rail as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. Liability? For what? I thought back to the moments she'd brushed me off when I asked about strange letters in the mail or when I mentioned odd inconsistencies in the paperwork Mark kept on his desk. At the time, I'd assumed it was just household bureaucracy. Now it felt like something entirely different. I stepped back slowly, afraid she might come outside and find me eavesdropping. My heart thudded painfully, each beat matching the steady rise of panic in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become a threat to something I didn't even know existed. And the worst part was that the two people who should have trusted me most were treating me like an enemy. When Mark finally found me later that afternoon, he looked pale and jumpy, as if he'd been running from something. His eyes darted around before settling on me with a mixture of guilt and fear. He asked if we could keep some space just for a while, saying things at the house were sensitive right now. His voice trembled, and the fact that he couldn't meet my eyes broke something inside me. For a moment, I just stared at him, trying to understand how we'd gone from building a future together to him pushing me away like a problem he needed to distance himself from. My mind buzzed with all the things I wanted to say, to demand, to scream. But the words tangled in my throat because I already knew something deeper was unraveling, something they were terrified I'd uncover. And standing there in the fading light, watching my husband shrink from me, I felt a loneliness I'd never known before. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just being excluded, I was being hidden from something. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Linda's cold stare, heard her calling me a liability, and felt Mark's trembling voice asking for space. The darkness in our guest room felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves knew something I didn't. By morning, I was done waiting for answers that no one was willing to give me. I decided to go back to the house while Linda was running her weekly errands. She always left for at least 2 hours around mid-morning, and Mark usually worked from his home office during that time. My plan wasn't dramatic. I just needed to grab some clothes, a charger, and maybe the pieces of my dignity. Mostly, I wanted to see Mark face to face and demand the truth he kept dodging. When I arrived, the street was quiet, and Linda's car was gone, just as I expected. What I didn't expect was the muffled shouting coming from inside the house. I froze halfway up the walkway, heart racing, because one of the voices belonged to Mark. The other, sharp and furious, was obviously Linda. I crept closer, careful not to step on the creaky boards of the porch. The front window was cracked open just enough for their voices to spill out into the morning air. Mark sounded cornered and exhausted, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to defend himself. Linda, however, had the tone of someone used to winning every argument by sheer force. "You should have kept her out of the paperwork entirely," Linda snapped, her voice sharp enough to slice through me even though she didn't know I was there. "She asks questions. She notices things. If she puts it together, we're both finished." My pulse thundered in my ears as I strained to understand what could possibly be so serious. Mark's response was a strained whisper, but I heard the tremor in his voice. I didn't think she'd look through it. I only forged what you told me to. I didn't know the estate accounts were already flagged. My breath caught so hard it felt like someone punched me in the chest. Forged? Estate accounts? Flagged? That single word forced everything to click into horrifying alignment. I staggered back from the window, my heart hammering as if it wanted to break free from my chest. I didn't want to believe what I had just heard, but denial was impossible when the truth was standing so clearly in front of me. I had accidentally stumbled onto something so serious that they were willing to shove me out of the house to protect it. And Mark, my own husband, was in the middle of it with her. I backed away from the window just in time to hear Mark's voice crack in desperation. Mom, I did what I did to help you. You put me in this position. If Elena knows anything, I swear she'll leave me. Linda's harsh scoff echoed through the pane of glass, followed by her cold assurance that I was too naive to understand numbers anyway. The familiarity of her condescension made my stomach turn. I slipped around to the side of the house, feeling like a trespasser in my own life. Every step I took felt heavier as the reality of what I'd uncovered settled over me. Mark and Linda weren't hiding relationship issues or family drama. They were hiding a financial mess big enough to terrify them, and I had been pushed out because I had unknowingly gotten too close to it. Once I reached the back door, I hesitated before gently testing the handle. It was unlocked, as it always was during the day, and I slipped inside without making a sound. The house felt eerie and still, despite the muffled arguing in the other room. I moved quickly, staying low, heading straight for the office where Mark kept all of his files. The office smelled like cologne and printer ink, familiar but suddenly sinister. Papers were scattered across the desk, along with a laptop still open to an email I recognized immediately. It was the estate account login screen, the same one I had accidentally seen weeks ago when I asked Mark why the balances never matched the paper statements. I remember the flicker of panic in his eyes when he told me not to worry about it. Compelled by equal parts rage and fear, I checked the email app on his laptop. There it was. A thread of messages between Mark and a financial advisor discussing signature discrepancies, irregular disbursements, and delayed fund transfers. My blood ran cold when I realized several of the documents mentioned had my name forged next to his. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, unable to process the magnitude of the betrayal. My hands shook so violently I had to brace myself against the desk to stay upright. I hadn't just been excluded from the truth, I had been unknowingly implicated in it. And if things kept spiraling, I could be dragged down with them. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe as I scanned through the emails again. Then I noticed something that made my pulse spike. Mark had forwarded copies of the documents to his personal cloud account. A twisted sense of relief washed over me, because that meant there was evidence I could access without being caught. Evidence that proved I wasn't imagining anything. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. I left the house with my heart pounding so violently it felt like it echoed inside my skull. The evidence I had copied onto my phone felt like a burning weight in my pocket, as though the truth itself was too hot to hold. Every instinct inside me screamed to run, but another part told me that running now would let them control the narrative. I'd been pushed out once this time, I wasn't backing away. I waited until evening, when Mark would be home from work, and Linda would be preparing her ritualistic late dinner. The house always softened during that time. Lights dimmed, the scent of rosemary and garlic drifted from the kitchen, and the tension usually lowered just enough to breathe. But as I walked toward the driveway, each step felt heavier, knowing what I was about to confront. My fingers twitched against my phone. The evidence burned into my screen like a lifeline. Mark opened the front door before I even knocked, as if he'd been pacing behind it waiting for impact. He looked drained, eyes hollow, shoulders slumped, and yet the guilt radiating off him was unmistakable. He tried to greet me with a weak smile, but it fell apart the second he saw my expression. The fear on his face told me he already knew I knew. We stepped inside, the silence stretching like a tight rope between us. I walked past him toward the living room, refusing to sit, refusing to make this comfortable for him. He lingered near the doorway, rubbing the back of his neck like a child caught lying. I could almost hear the words forming in his throat, but I didn't let him speak first. "Why?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the storm raging inside me. The words seemed to freeze him in place, his eyes widening slightly as if he'd been waiting for a different question. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally sank onto the edge of the sofa, burying his face in his hands. Watching him crumble didn't soothe me, it just sharpened the ache. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked so quietly I had to lean in to hear. He said he never meant for things to go this far, that Linda had pressured him to fix mistakes in the estate paperwork years ago. She promised it would all be temporary, that no one would ever check the original signatures or trace the transfers. But when the accounts were flagged for review, panic took over, and I became the unexpected threat. I felt my breath shorten as he admitted that yes, he had forged my name on several documents. He insisted he only did it because using my name made the transfers look less suspicious to auditors. The explanation made bile rise in my throat, because it wasn't just illegal. It was a betrayal so intimate and cowardly that I felt physically nauseated. He didn't choose me, he used me. We were still in the middle of that painful unraveling when Linda stormed into the room. She must have overheard everything, because her face was twisted with a fury I'd never seen before. Her voice lashed through the room as she accused me of ruining everything and dragging Mark down with my meddling. The venom in her tone was so sharp it made my skin crawl, but she had no idea I wasn't empty-handed. I pulled out my phone and held it tightly, the way someone holds a shield. Linda immediately froze, her eyes flashing with a fear she couldn't hide. I told her I had every email, every document, every forwarded file backed up. The color drained from her cheeks so fast it was almost satisfying. Mark let out a shaky breath, looking between us like a man watching the final collapse of a sinking ship. He whispered my name, pleading for something mercy, maybe, or forgiveness, but I wasn't ready to offer either. Not after what they had done. Not after the lies, the humiliation, the manipulation. Linda tried to regain her composure, straightening her spine and forcing a cold smirk onto her face. She said no one would believe me, that family business was complicated, and that I wouldn't dare risk dragging Mark down with her. Her confidence sounded brittle, like someone building walls out of paper and praying they hold. That was when I delivered the ultimatum that had been forming inside me all day. I told Mark he had one chance, one only to come clean. He could choose honesty and face the consequences with integrity, or he could hide behind his mother and let everything burn around him. The decision was his, and for a moment he just stared at me, torn between fear and the possibility of redemption. Mark didn't answer right away. He looked like a man standing on the edge of an impossible choice, shifting between the woman who had raised him and the woman he had married. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and for a moment I thought he might collapse under the pressure. But then something in his expression changed. His shoulders straightened, his breathing steadied, and he finally lifted his eyes to meet mine. He said he was done living under Linda's control. His voice cracked, but the conviction was real, and I watched the realization wash over Linda's face like a tidal wave of fury and fear. When he told her he was going to the authorities, she lunged forward and grabbed his arm, practically hissing that he owed her his loyalty. Mark gently pulled away, and the small motion felt like the collapse of a lifelong power dynamic. I stood there, numb, listening as he told her he was going to make things right. He wasn't confessing because he believed in legal consequences or moral duty. He was doing it because he finally understood the weight of what he had dragged me into. His voice shook when he admitted he'd been terrified of losing me, terrified of disappointing his mother, and trapped between the two until he broke. But instead of pity, all I felt was a tired, heavy sadness settling over my chest. Linda's reaction was explosive. She grabbed stacks of papers off the counter, ripping documents and screaming accusations that made no sense. She ranted that I had poisoned Mark against her, that everything was fine until I came along, twisting her son into weakness. Watching her unravel so violently almost made me step back, because it was no longer just hostility, it was desperation. Mark tried to calm her, but she turned on him with a venom that stunned both of us. She blamed him for every mistake, every oversight, every unraveling thread of her poorly hidden crimes. Her voice rose and cracked until it was barely intelligible. a stream of panic disguised as rage. The woman who always controlled everything was finally losing control. And then she said the one thing that sealed her fate forever: that she would rather bring everyone down with her than let us destroy everything she built. That single sentence was the final nail in her coffin. Mark whispered, "I'm sorry," and walked out to call the authorities. I didn't follow him right away. I stayed in the living room, watching Linda pace in frantic circles, the realization of what was coming sinking into her expression like a slow poison. For the first time since I met her, she looked small. Not intimidating, not condescending, just a frightened woman trapped in the consequences she'd created. When the police arrived, Linda's argumentative bluster dissolved instantly. She tried to charm, then threaten, then deny, but none of it mattered once they saw the documents and the evidence Mark had surrendered. They escorted her out while she screamed that this was betrayal, that a real family would protect her. The irony of her words made something inside me finally break loose. Mark gave his full statement, confessing to the forgeries and explaining how she had pressured him. The officers told him he would likely face legal consequences too, but cooperating would lighten them significantly. I watched him sign the forms with a heavy resignation on his face, and although part of me respected the courage it took, another part felt a deep, aching distance forming between us. This wasn't something a marriage easily survived. Over the next few weeks, our home life became a quiet, fragile shell. Mark tried to apologize every day, bringing me breakfast, writing long messages, trying to prove he was changing. But the trust between us had been cracked too deeply, and every attempt he made only highlighted the wound. I felt like a ghost drifting through the remnants of what once felt stable. One morning, I packed my things. I told him I wasn't leaving out of spite or vengeance. I was leaving because I needed a life that wasn't built on secrets, manipulation, or fear. Mark cried, begging me to reconsider, but I could see in his eyes that he understood. He knew I wasn't punishing him. I was saving myself. Months passed quietly after that. I moved into a small apartment, took a job closer to the city, and slowly rebuilt the parts of myself I had lost, living under someone else's control. Therapy helped. Time helped even more. Each day that Linda wasn't hovering over my shoulder and Mark wasn't flinching under guilt felt like a breath of fresh air I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Then one afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was Mark's, shaky but familiar, and inside was a long note detailing his ongoing therapy, his remorse, and his acceptance of responsibility. He didn't beg for another chance this time. Instead, he thanked me for giving him the push he needed to finally break free from his mother's influence. When I finished reading, I felt something loosen deep inside me. It wasn't joy or sorrow, just peace. The kind of peace I had been denied for far too long.